In part 1 of chapter 28, we took a look at a number of phyla of the invertebrates up through phylum Annelida, which were the segmented worms. Beginning in this part 2, we will pick up looking at the next phylum in a group called the protostomes, and these next two phyla are very large and very diverse. They're called Nematoda and Arthropoda. Both of them are known to have an exoskeleton or a rigid outer shell, which is made of chitin. And for both of these phyla, they will molt these outer exoskeletons during their development. So the first group, the phylum Nematoda, these are called the roundworms. We find that they are what we call pseudo-coelomates. Remember, everybody from after Cnidaria are all bilaterally symmetrical, but they have different coelomate or body cavity structures. This particular group, the nematodes, are pseudo-coelomates, meaning that they have a false body cavity. In this particular organization, there is a cavity which develops, but it's between the mesoderm and the endoderm. It's not completely embedded in the mesoderm, hence it's not a true coelomate organism. Now, these roundworms can be free-living, but many of them are parasitic, meaning that they live in their hosts. And we see some pictures here of a mass of roundworms being removed from an organism. They're very commonly found in our pets, our dogs and our cats. But there is a very popular roundworm called Caenorhabditis elegans, and this, or C. elegans is much easier to say, which is a very popular organism, roundworm, used for research. So you may ask why. Well, this is a soil-living roundworm that eats E. coli. It's not parasitic. But as far as why is it good for research, they're transparent, they're very easy to keep and maintain, they have a short life cycle, and they can be very easily genetically modified. So they're great for lots of studies where we want to look at the effects of, say, a particular genetic path or maybe a drug treatment on an animal, but we don't want to use a higher order animal. Now, these phylum Nematoda, these roundworms, can be either monoecious or dioecious, meaning they can be hermaphroditic, monoecious, they can have both sexes, or they can have separate sexes. Now, the other group that has the exoskeletons is the phylum Arthropoda. And this is a huge group of organisms. This comes from the word, Arthropoda comes from the word of jointed feet or legs, and we noticed that their legs are segmented and have joints which move. Now, this group dominates the animal kingdom. Over 85% of all known animals, more than 1 million of species, fall into this phylum Arthropoda. Their exoskeleton is also made of the polysaccharide chitin, that rigid polysaccharide. They are found to have what's called an open circulatory system. So they have a space called a hemocoel, which is the cavity containing the organs. They are coelomate. They do have a true body cavity. But they don't, and they have hearts, but they don't have blood vessels. So the heart will pump fluid, their blood, in and around their organs, in their body cavity, but not through blood vessels. Their respiration, many of them are land animals, some are water animals, but they use different organs for respiration. If they are a water animal like the crustaceans, then they're going to use gills. If they are a land animal, they have an interesting network of tubes, tracheae, which end in little spiracles, little openings that are structured all along their body so that air can come directly into and out of their body and not have to utilize lungs. So when we look at the phylum Arthropoda, we're going to break them down into 4 classes. Now, in your book, they call these subphyla, and there's much debate over whether that these groupings should be a subphylum or a in between the phylum and the classes, but for simplicity's sake, we're just going to call them classes. So remember, kingdom, phylum, class. So the first class is Insecta, also called Hexapoda. Hex is the prefix meaning 6, and everybody in this group has 6 legs. We then have the class Myriapoda, or myriad, which means many, and these have many legs. We then have the class Crustacea, which is the class that has many aquatic species. And then we have the class Arachnida, which have 8 legs. So we'll take a look at each one of these classes. Here we'll start off with class Insecta. Class Insecta is the largest group of arthropods, so the largest group within the arthropod phylum. Everyone in this phylum, all species, have 6 legs. They have 3 body regions. So there's a head, so there's evidence of cephalization, of sensory structures being organized in a head region. There's then the thorax, and this is where you find the attachment of the 3 legs. 1, 2, 3 pairs of legs, excuse me. And then there is an abdomen, which is towards the posterior end of the animal, and this is where you find the digestive system and the reproductive system. Now, many insects are dioecious, meaning they have males or females, but others have different sexual groupings. So all members of this class Insecta go through metamorphosis, meaning they go through developmental stages where they look very different. So there's the larvae, the juvenile, and the adult. And as they go through these stages, they metamorphosize or change. They also molt their exoskeleton, so they leave that behind in a similar way that the nematodes will molt between their developmental stages. The last thing to notice anatomically is that they have a circulatory system, which is an open circulatory system. So they have a string of hearts, of heart-like structures, and they will pump fluid through their body cavity. They are coelomates, and then that fluid gets returned to the hearts, but no system of blood vessels. The next phylum, within the phylum Arthropoda is the class Myriapoda. Myria meaning many legs. And within it, there's 2 major groups, the centipedes and the millipedes. Now from this, you would think centi means 100, milli means 1,000. So you would expect 100 legs and 1,000 legs. But really, there's no more than several 100 legs per organism. There are not organisms that have thousands of legs. They are distinguished between the fact that the centipedes have 1 set of legs per segment. They are segmented organisms, and the millipedes have 2 sets of legs per segment. And the are carnivores, meaning they eat other animals that eat animals. And the herbivores will eat usually other insects that eat plants. Our next class within Arthropoda is the class Crustacea. And so these include crabs, lobsters, shrimp, crayfish, and barnacles. They're mostly aquatic, being either freshwater or marine or saltwater, but there are some examples that live on land. Their respiration, therefore, because most of them are aquatic, will be through gills. They have what's called a cephalothorax and an abdomen, so they combine the head and the thorax into one structure. So we can see it on this crab. One structure is the cephalothorax combined together, and then the remaining body structure would be the abdomen. And their body covering is called a carapace. Now, interestingly, their very first set of legs, their very first appendage, is branched into two parts, which make little pincers or grabbers. Our final class within phylum Arthropoda will be the class Arachnida. So these are spiders, mites, ticks, and scorpions. There is also a larger group which does include the horseshoe crab, so that's why it's here in the picture. These organisms also have a cephalothorax, a combined head and thorax or chest region, and then an abdomen. They have chelicerae, which are claw-like or fang-like mouth parts. Claw-like or fang-like mouth parts. And they have 8 legs. So this differentiates them from the class Insecta. And they have blue blood, which means that they do have a different color to their blood than, say, we do, because the primary metal that's in their blood is copper instead of iron, like it is in our blood. Okay, so everything up to now has been, of the bilateral symmetry organisms, have been protostomes. We're now going to look at deuterostome animals. So the deuterostomes, remember, are the ones that also have 2 openings to their digestive system, to their gut, but the very first to develop is the anus instead of the mouth, as is the case with the protostomes. So in the deuterostomes, we have 2 groups or 2 phyla that we're going to look at, the echinoderms and the chordates. The echinoderms fall into the invertebrates, and then we have our only phylum of vertebrates. So the only ones with a cranium or a cavity for the brain and a spinal column. So echinoderms do not have that structure, so they are invertebrates. Now, Chapter 28 deals only with the invertebrates, with a very brief mention of the vertebrates, the chordates at the end, and so that will be the case for the rest of this talk. So let's take a look at the phylum Echinodermata. Echino means spiny. Derma means skin, so they have a spiny skin or little projections all over their bodies. Some of the organisms that we're talking about are the sea stars, the brittle stars, sea urchins, sand dollars, etc. So this is a very interesting group because they are considered bilateral, but in their adult form, they exhibit radial symmetry. It's only the larval form that has a bilateral symmetry to it, but they get to be put into the organisms that are bilateral because that is what they develop from. They develop from bilateral symmetry, but they will transition over to radial symmetry as they reach their adult stage. One very interesting thing about members from this group, they are capable of regeneration. So you can cut off up to 75% of a sea star and it will regrow itself. They have what's called a water vascular system. So they do have a closed vascular system, unlike some of the previous organisms we've talked about. So they do have a way to keep fluids within their body. But what they do is they pump water instead of blood. And that's how they do their gas exchange, because they're aquatic organisms. And up to this point, we've seen a lot of development of cephalization in the animals, even up through the arthropods, where we were looking at head regions. But echinoderms do not have a head region. They do not exhibit cephalization. They do have something called a nerve ring, which is a circular ring of nervous material, and we'll see that in another slide. So here we have some examples that fall into echinodermata. We have the typical sea star, or what was called starfish. Here we have a brittle star, which has much longer arms. Here is a sea urchin. We don't see the sea dollar, but we'll see some of those in lab. Sea lilies and sea cucumbers. Now, all of these organisms have a tiny endoskeleton. They have a skeleton inside their bodies, which in these organisms is very tiny, but when we get into the chordates, we'll find that the endoskeleton, the bony structure inside, is much more substantial. Also, the majority of these organisms are dioecious, meaning they have two genders. As far as what do these organisms eat, their major prey is primarily the mollusks, the clams and scallops, etc. So here we see a model of a sea star, and we can look inside part of it. Here we see the little spines, which give its name, spiny skin, echinodermata. We see that there is the stomach region, which goes out to intestines. We see the gonads, which are the reproductive structures. We don't see the nerve ring because it's underneath the stomach here, but we do see a extension going out into each of the arms. There's an extension that goes out to each of the arms with the nervous system. So the only other phylum left to investigate, and we'll be doing that in chapter 29, is the phylum Chordata. But I'd like to just introduce that chapter by saying that all chordates are going to possess certain characteristics, and I'll list them, that are found at some point in their life cycle. Sometimes this is only when they are embryos, during their embryological. So if we look at the first structure that's found, it's called the dorsal hollow nerve cord. So the dorsal hollow nerve cord, which is shown in yellow here. The dorsal surface is the back surface of the organism. So there's dorsal, ventral, anterior, and posterior. Front, back, or back end, back, and belly. So the dorsal hollow nerve cord will eventually become the brain and the spinal cord, or the nervous tissue. The second structure is called the notochord, so don't get those too confused. The notochord is shown in gray, and that will actually become the spinal column, which is made of bone. So the notochord does not become nervous tissue. The third structure is the postanal tail. So that becomes the tail in certain animals in Chordata, but not every animal has a tail. And the pharyngeal slits. So these become gills in aquatic animals, but they do not become lungs in land animals. In land animals, they become the jaw and the ear. So the lungs come from different embryological structures. So each embryo will exhibit these four characteristics at some point during its development if that organism is in phylum Chordata. So that is all on Chordata until the next chapter.